this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Wherever you find us, whether it's a video or podcast on your favorite platform, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. You can also find us on major social media platforms. If you go to miamighostchronicles.com, you can find links to the videos or MP3 files, which you can download and enjoy without commercial interruptions. If you're into classic horror, ghost, and adventure stories, I narrate Nightshade Diary, and you can find links at nightshadediary.com. If scary stories are your bag, and listening to encounters with cryptids, ghosts, dogman, and other weird creatures sends a shiver up your spine, then go to supernaturalstorytime.com for links to our weekly podcasts. Noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird can be found at eerie.news or visit the Stranger Than Fiction Stories tab at miamighostchronicles.com. Please subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just go to mppellicer.com for a link. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi, how's everybody doing? Good? Everything is going good over here in North Florida. You know, getting into spring. I mentioned in my last show, I bought some planters. I'm going to do by the way, I tried this before. That's what I'm saying. I'm going to try I'm planting some vegetables, onions, garlic, all that other neat stuff. And this time I brought it closer because the last time, between the chickens, the squirrels, the birds, everybody kind of decimated all my efforts. So this time I have like a gazebo out front, and I brought some planters close to there. And I've got some netting, and I'm going to see how that works. So I'm going to do the Green Acres thing, you know, since I already have the chickens, might as well, right? But yeah, I'm curious to see what comes of it. Partly because I want to see if I can do it. The other part is, believe it or not, this is as close to organic because I don't spray. I don't do anything on my property, period. So that's as close to organic as it's going to get. Which would probably, if I went and I bought it at one of these specialty stores, would cost a lot of money. But yeah. And my next step, if, you know how that goes, if it does work out and I actually grow stuff, which by the way, they look really good. Then I'm going to look at maybe freeze drying them, or, you know, I don't know. I got to figure that one out depending on what we produce. But yeah, that's what I'm up to now in the spring, because for down in Florida, January, February were the months to plant. So I had already started planting, and I'll keep you guys updated how that goes or doesn't, because believe it or not, like I said, you know, we take it for granted that farming is an easy thing, and it's not. Even on a small scale, it is not. It is not. You got to pay attention to what you're doing. And yeah, well, what can I say? Anyway, let's get on to the good part. The good part is, who is the guest tonight at Stories of the Supernatural? This is the first name that he's here as a guest, and his name is Dacre Stoker, and he is the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker and the international best-selling co-author of Dracula the Un-Dead, which is a sequel to Dracula, and Dracul, a prequel to Dracula, which was the UK's #1 best-selling hardcover novel in horror and supernatural in 2018, and a top 5 finalist by the Horror Writers Association for the Bram Stoker Awards for superior achievement in a novel. He has film rights for Dracul, have been optioned by Paramount Studios. Dacre is also the co-editor of the Lost Journal of Bram Stoker, The Dublin Years, and he is a native of Montreal, Canada. He's taught physical education and sciences for 22 years in both Canada and the U.S. He's participated in the sport of modern pentathlon as an athlete and a coach at the international and Olympic levels for Canada for 12 years. He is also an avid player and coach of the unique game of real tennis. I have to ask him about that. In September of 2022, an athlete he had been coaching for the past 10 years, Camden Revere, won the World Championships of Court Tennis. Dacre and his wife, Jen, have lived in Aiken, South Carolina for the past 30 years. He is currently the executive director of Aiken's Streetscapes, a foundation dedicated to the preservation and protection of Aiken's grand trees. He has consulted and appeared in recent film documentaries about vampires in literature and popular culture. The Real Vampire Files from 2010 on the History Channel, The Tillinghast Nightmare 2014 Historical Haunts, Secrets of the Dead 2015 on PBS, Mysteries at the Museum 2017 on the Travel Channel, Legend Hunter, 2019 on the Travel Channel, American Vampires, 2022 on Fox Nation. He currently hosts tours to Dublin, Ireland, Whitby, England, and Cruden Bay, Scotland, to visit places where Bram Stoker lived, was educated, worked, researched, and wrote Dracula. He also leads groups to Transylvania to explore both the life and times of the historic Vlad Dracula the Un-Dead, and also the locations where Bram Stoker set his famous novel. Help me welcome him. How are you doing today, Dacre?
Marlene, I'm doing great. It just one minor correction.
Go ahead.
Not many people get the pronunciation of my first name. So before I tell you what it is, all you listeners, how do you think you pronounce Dacre? Kind of blessed with a curse because my parents gave it to me.
You know what? I'm gonna go. I would see it with a soft A. Dacre.
Try it. Dacre.
Dacre. Okay, I'm complicating this. Okay.
Yeah, it's the harder A. It's like an acre of land with a D.
Yes, with a D.
It comes from Lord of the Acre way back in,
really?
in Irish times. Yeah, D apostrophe acre. So
Dacre.
That was actually a name passed down. Bram Stoker, my great-granduncle's father, had a brother. He had a son. He christened him Dacre Stoker. So my parents.
So it's a family name then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
So thank you for having me. Now we've got the name straightened out, Marlene.
Yes.
I'm happy to be
You know what?
here.
I will never forget it. It's like acre with a D at the front. Dacre. That's it. That's all I need. The synapses in my brain went. So I got it. I don't know what I was trying to Frenchify your name. I don't know what I was trying to do there.
Listen, my friend, everybody gets it wrong. and in a funny way, it's like it's a great opening icebreaker because there were all these, hey, what big deal. The guy's got like 100 different versions of his name. I'll give you one quick story. My two sisters loved to roast me on it. When we were small, we used to ride ponies and horses and horse shows, and they would go to the announcer and they would tell them how to pronounce my name wrong. So I'd be going into little class. Well, yes, and riding Jiminy Cricket was Dacre Stoker or Dacre Stoker. So my sisters love to pull the, just get me as zingers on that. So I'm used to it.
Okay, all right. You've been handling this for a long time.
Yeah.
I feel so bad there. Let me ask you, and I'm going to ask you, which I'm sure everybody asks you. Obviously, you're related by family to Bram Stoker, but as far as I know, maybe I might be wrong, you're one of the only family members that took up the mantle of his writings as far as to do something with it.
Yeah. So here how it is. Bram was one of 7 children. Mm-hmm. And of that family, his youngest brother, George, was my great-grandfather. Okay. He had kids, obviously, a son and a daughter. The son came to Montreal, Canada after World War II. That's how the family started in Canada. Bram himself had a son, Noel. That son had a daughter. She married twice, actually, during World War II. Both her husbands died in the war. And there are 2 great-grandsons from that lineage, my cousins. Okay. And only one of the other members of the family had any children, and they've died out. So of a family of 7, only 2 active branches of the big tree still survive. And those cousins of mine are in their 80s, and they're retired chartered accountants. They're great guys, but they're not really outgoing, not super creative, and they're not really interested in, doing research and coming on shows and so on. So they've given me their blessing, and I actually helped with my wife manage the Bram Stoker estate, Bram Stoker's intellectual property for them. So we're all tied up in this, but I've sort of become the de facto spokesman. I've done the research, written the books with co-authors, and I'm the guy that's sort of the receptacle of all the cool stuff, and I get to do fun things with it.
So let me ask you, I'm sure maybe you knew within the family certain things, but when you were doing your research, did you come across anything that you were like, man, I didn't know that?
That's an understatement. I mean, talk about it. Like, where do you want to go with this? I mean, I guess what I'm going to say is, to make it easy to answer this, there was many, many things, but let's go with the first thing that really threw me for a zinger. Okay. And that was when I was researching for Dracula the Un-Dead. I wrote with Ian Holt the sequel to Dracula first, and I had to really get into Bram's life himself. So you start with the existing biographies. At the time, I didn't know if they were good or not because I really didn't know that much. So I read the 4 biographies that I knew existed. And one of them, by Harry Ludlam, the first one, led me to Trinity College.
Okay.
And so what I found out was he got a lot of information from Bram's son Noel, and Noel put all these things at Trinity. So I went to look for the source notes that Noel allowed Harry Ludlam to use. And so about half of it was included in the book. The other half, who's not been disclosed yet, because Harry didn't use it all. And one of those really cool things, Marlene, that was in there was, starts with Bram's youth. He had a very mysterious childhood illness that left him an invalid for the first 7 years of his life. Okay. And so what I did with that was I sort of like, how do you think that affected him? And his son alluded to the fact that my father had nightmares throughout his life, starting in his childhood. So then I connected with doctors who specialized forensically in Victorian medicine. Okay. What would have the types of conditions that were prevalent, the types of conditions that somebody could actually recover from at the age of 7, and then 10 years later, he's a champion all-around athlete at Trinity
I was going to
College.
say, I had always heard that he was a very athletic person, so I'm surprised by what you said.
And just, I was too, and having an Olympic background myself and coaching, like, how does a guy go from an invalid, can't walk, to, 10 years later, he's doing race walking, winning trophies, rugby, rowing, gymnastics, track and field. That just didn't make sense to me. And so I started digging around and figuring that other members of the Stoker family on Bram's uncle's side were very famous doctors. 3 of Bram's brothers, my great-grandfather became a doctor. And that none of them would have treated their brother, obviously, but the older uncles would have. And they were quite well known and wrote treatises on bloodletting. Okay. So I am now convinced, as I dig into the pieces that the sons said, the other uncles, what they had practiced, the ailment Bram probably had, and the fevers that would have produced. So I believe he was bloodlet. And when I look at bloodletting, and if your listeners don't know what that was like in the Victorian era, they either put leeches on you and sucked out blood, or they cut you and the blood drained out. But these treatises that I read said they didn't really know how much to take out. Like it was, like
I've heard that
nowadays
that some people, they kind of like killed them in a way sometimes.
Well, yeah, essentially they would take out enough blood for you to pass out. And then they'd patch up the hole or take off the leeches and wait for you to come around, and they would give you a mixture.
Right, the humors, I believe, is what they referred to it as.
It was the 4 humors of the blood, and they knew that the blood was made up of the good parts and the bad parts, but they couldn't separate it as they were taking it, so they took it all out. Not all of it, but a lot of it. But to rehydrate you, they gave you a mixture of claret, which is red wine, and oil. So if you've ever given blood, any of you listeners, you know how dehydrated you get. They give you apple juice or orange juice, but when they give you enough for you to pass out, and now they give you red wine, you're going to be in a stupor. You're going to be.
Yeah, that was great. Let's do this again.
Yeah, exactly. So, and as a kid, so I think that to me was one of the most interesting things, and it led down a deeper rabbit hole about Uncle Bram, about what it would have been like to be a sickly little kid, and would have all that stuff have driven you to nightmares. And when I look into what nightmares back in those days were looked at as signs of demonic possession. When you're asleep and you cannot ward off the powers of the evil, then it's like demonic possession. So, and nightmare, you can't control your thoughts. The bad thoughts take over. Sometimes there's even trances and night walking. So that, I think, it's a good way to start the show, to say that's my number one zinger. And that's a very good reason why J.D.
Well, I can see as a little boy that maybe your uncles, or they're trying to treat you, but you realize whenever they treat me, I feel really bad. It was, I'm sure it must not have been a pleasant experience for a child to do that bloodletting thing.
No kidding.
And maybe that
did kill him, but it probably messed up his mind real badly, though.
Sure, of course. It was like, oh my God. And they're like, this is, these are the times where, children, were seen and not heard kind of deal.
Yeah.
So it was like, don't protest. We're doing this for your own good. You're a child. Be quiet. We're doing this to make you better, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, people don't realize that for a while that as a matter of fact, I even heard that George Washington on his deathbed, they think that he was pushed over to die because of excessive bloodletting.
Yeah, that was popular even in those days. I mean, and literally, as you said earlier, they understood that the body was made up of blood of four humors, because when they would put it into a jar, when it comes out of the body, over a few days it would separate, and you'd see four different colors. What they didn't figure out was you got to leave that stuff in the body, because the white blood cells, one of the humors, is what fights off infection. So
exactly.
But if they do take out some of the bad stuff, maybe there's enough of the good stuff that comes back and fights off the infection. But in the case of poor George Washington, I mean, they would do this stuff repeatedly. I'm not sure. Do you know of any idea what it was that he was ailing?
I can't remember. I mean, he was already older. I'm not saying he was going to be in the best of health, but from what I understand, he was getting better, and they did it, and it kind of like basically they got carried away.
Sure.
And I imagine if you're older and maybe you're suffering from something, this was the last, what pushes you over the edge. I was reading on that. Yeah. And sometimes it's impossible to really know, was that really what causes death? But from what they were saying, that there's a possibility that excessive bloodletting was actually what put him in the grave. So there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. People don't realize that was normal. That was
it was totally normal. It was not experimental surgery stuff. It was normal to be bloodlet. And even during that childhood illness, the other thing I learned is the weird medical thing, is that his mother, at the age of 14, Bram's mother, experienced a cholera epidemic in 1832 in Western Ireland, where she was born and raised. They had no idea what caused the cholera back in those days.
Okay.
It was transmitted by bodily fluid, but nobody knew. And they thought it was maybe airborne. They thought that, by touch.
Yes.
So doctors and nurses were all dying because they didn't have, personal protective gear like they do nowadays.
Right.
And they'd bring the people into the hospitals and lay them out. They had no cure, no bloodletting for cholera. They simply would give you laudanum, which is an oral morphine, for you to eventually die comfortably. And what she told Bram, and I'll tell you this, which is weird, also in Trinity College, Marlene, his mother, later on in her life, at Bram's request, wrote down the bedtime story she told him about her witnessing somebody being misdiagnosed in this hospital and buried prematurely and crawling out of the grave.
You know what? People don't realize that between what they call the resurrectionist and being buried alive, dying, people were really wigging out, and with good reason, about this, because people would go into maybe the equivalent of a coma or whatever, and they would be buried, and that's why there were people that it was like this concerned them greatly, that they would be buried alive.
And the thing is, when the nurses, who all died first, because they were touching and caring for these people.
Yes.
So they were the ones trained to diagnose, as were the doctors. But when the nurses are dead and a lot of doctors are dead, the street people would come in, get paid some money to help care for these poor dying people. They would not have diagnosed a person in a coma or catalepsy or anything. No, they just
throw them on the pile over there.
Throw them on the pile and make room on the gurney for somebody else. So
and if they were buried in a mass grave, forget it. That's it. You're toast if you were alive.
Well, that's how this is the story of their neighbors that did. And the husband went to pay his respects, and he saw this red scarf of his wife's covered in the piles of bodies, and he started pulling the bodies off. He didn't care if he could get the contact with the contagious cholera. And his wife started moving and came out of the grave.
Oh my God.
And she lived for many years. She, for some reason, by luck of God or whatever, she did not catch the cholera or have it to start with.
Now, you know what? And they say that even with the Black Plague, that there's people that just have natural immunities to some of these diseases. And they could because up to a certain point, they realized that once you caught something, you were immune. But there were people walking around that never caught it or were asymptomatic. And they of course they never understood why some people would come down with it, but the majority, and then there would be people that wouldn't.
That's right. Some of those mysteries.
Yes, of course. Again, like Typhoid Mary, here she was.
Yeah.
She was killing a bunch of people with typhus,
But she never, and from what I understand, even until the day she died, she didn't believe that she was the one that had caused those outbreaks of typhus because she was
Wow.
handling food when she was cooking it.
Yeah.
She, in her brain, she was like, no, 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 because she didn't understand that she was asymptomatic with the typhus. So
Yeah.
there
I
you
mean,
go.
they didn't know much about, I mean, all these contagious diseases, they had no idea what was going on.
No,
None
no, and
whatsoever.
of course, they say really that what really helped with the diseases when they started to understand about hygiene.
Yeah.
Like with the equipment and with hands and all that. That's when we
Yeah.
kind of caught on with less deaths. Now, when you what inspired him to do this, to go down this road as far as the story, this subject
So
matter?
there's a lot of little bits and pieces, Marlene, and I'll try to sum it up this way because I give like 90-minute lecture on many different pieces that contribute to this. But let me just tell you now contributing factors to this because I can generalize it by saying this. He wove things that happened into his life, like the story I just told you of the cholera epidemic and the neighbor coming out of the grave, Irish
Right.
folklore and mythology that already contained vampires and superstition of folklore of banshees and goblins and these things. He did tremendous amount of research in both the London Library, the Whitby Library, Marsh's Library about people that had gone to places like Transylvania, other parts of Romania, and had experienced and written about superstitions of the vampires Strigoi, Nosferatu. He also was a theater manager of the Lyceum Theater, and his
Mm-hmm.
boss, Henry Irving, played the role of the devil, Mephistopheles, on stage for many years. And then, of course, you got the ghostly Macbeth that he played for many
Yes.
years. So I think what Bram was doing, because let me back up one step, Marlene. During the time he wrote it, between 1890 and 1896, and the book was published in 1897, there was a huge rise in interest in the occult in England. And when I say the occult, as you very well know, being the Miami Ghost Chronicles, the focus on spiritualism,
Yes.
mesmerism, tarot
Mm-hmm.
cards, seance, all these things
Yes.
were on a big rise, much like paranormal investigation is
Yes.
nowadays. It's
Yes.
huge.
Yes.
But
Yes.
what was happening in culture in England is that science, Charles Darwin had just published The Origin of the Species and it started questioning, all of religion, essentially, how,
Yes.
animals were just placed into an ark and they showed up all over the world.
Right. Evolution.
He
Evolution.
was, his theory of evolution came out and rocked the world, religious world. So the religious whole power on the knowledge of how life and death worked was beginning to wane, and science was
Yes.
beginning to ask questions. And as science asked questions, men and women who were very curious were beginning to wonder what happens with the spirits of the dead? What is really going on? Can we communicate with them? So all of these things are on a rise. And Bram Stoker, being a theater manager, was not stupid. He knew how to alter the plays that they were putting on in the Lyceum Theater, how to attract people into those seats, and so on. So he knew the same thing about books. So all those things that I just mentioned about his research, his personal experiences, he also knew what the demographic of his reader in London would be attuned to. Now, he didn't write the first vampire book. That was John Polidori. And then
Yes.
Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu wrote
Fanu.
Carmilla. And then Malcolm Reimer wrote Varney. So Bram, came to the party, 40, 50 years late. But what he did with Dracula, this book over my shoulder here, was he
Yes.
packaged it in a way that made this supernatural count seem real, and real to the extent where many events in the story were based on real things, like the ship coming
Yes.
into Whitby, the train schedules coming across Europe, the places in London, the graveyard in London. Even the people were
Yeah,
in
people could
this
say,
story.
"Hey, I could," yeah, of course, they could place themselves
That's
there
right.
so easily. Yes.
That's exactly. So that's, to me, when you say what inspired Bram, he wanted to scare the
Yes.
heck out of people with a very
And it worked.
realistic story based on something that their nerves were already on edge for.
Yes.
The whole supernatural piece. But it wasn't just a supernatural novel. When you really think about it, Marlene, it was a mystery crime thriller with a major supernatural twist to it. Because what was happening? There was deaths going on in London, mostly by the Count, Lucy being one of them. And who had to actually kill Lucy? The band of heroes and her fiance had to kill Lucy and get away with it from the police while they were searching Dracula on their own, because they probably figured that there was going to be no court system in stodgy London that would believe them that there's a supernatural creature coming along killing people, and they were not to blame.
Exactly. We're the only ones that know this, so like, who's going to believe that this? Of course, and he's a count, suppose and who's going to question him? So it's what, and of course there was not that in those years, not that long, was Jack the Ripper and all these things as far as the I want to say the atmosphere. I've never been to London, but it's like placing everybody there as far as in their head when they're seeing this play. It's like, wow.
Yeah, no, you're right. Actually, the Jack the Ripper murders, I'm convinced, influenced Bram. It actually influenced Stoker and Irving with the type of plays that they were putting on at the Lyceum, because it only happened just a few years before Bram started writing the novel Dracula in 1890 that anybody putting on a play didn't want to scare people from coming out of their homes. They're already scared to walk the streets or take a carriage and go to the theater district to go and watch a play. And did they really need a horrifying, scary story when they're already worried about all these horrific murders that the police could not catch the perpetrator? So they were aware of that. And I really honestly believe that was something that Bram was keyed in on. And I find it fascinating that he did not have much of an element of the police in the novel Dracula with all the killings. And I say, well, look, if the police aren't going to be able to catch Jack the Ripper, how are they going to catch a supernatural count?
That's a very good point. Exactly. This was, and even now, nobody, I mean, there's been a million theories as to who Jack the Ripper was, but really, many years later, they still don't have definitive proof that was the person or persons, because I know there's people saying there's more than one, whatever.
Yeah,
But yes, despite supposedly, from what I understand, being some pretty good people detecting it, but...
Well, do you remember the novelist Patricia Cornwell? Yes. She spent a boatload of money, wrote a really interesting story.
I read that book.
And they had used DNA evidence and so on, but it was still a little bit inconclusive, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yeah. It was, I believe, I can't remember the names, but he was like an artist that at some point was, and she basically followed his movements and showed, I mean, really, the explanation was excellent. As far as, and when I read it, I was like, God, that's the guy. Right. But then again, there's that other one.
There's a guy, Tumblety, Francis Tumblety, that's a major sort of potential that took off and went to North America. So
they had not too long ago, and some of these things, sometimes it's like there was another one, Maybrick, the James Maybrick, that they supposedly discovered, and he kind of like they found the diary where he's confessing that it was him. One of those deals.
Sure.
And again, I'm going to give everybody a real quick example. This was something, as a matter of fact, that I recently was researching. One of the things of the Ripper murders, where it was supposedly somebody that was knowledgeable in anatomy, that this is why he is dissecting these poor women.
Cutting up of the body, yeah.
Right. Back in the 1930s in the Czechoslovakia, they had a series of murders of prostitutes. One of them, which... they found basically 2 luggage boxes were shipped via the train. They had basically dismembered her.
Oh, gosh.
And now what happens is, and this is, the initial autopsy report said that the way she had been, they had cut off her head. The medical examiner said, oh, this is somebody that is knowledgeable about anatomy. So what do the police do? They're looking at doctors, they're looking at medical students. Come to find out later when they look, and this I'm talking years later.
Sure.
Looked into the case. They said that basically as a matter of fact, in 2017 is when they really, without DNA evidence, but they pointed at a sergeant in the military that she was involved in, that basically, but they realized that the way she was cut, basically was from brute force with a saber. It wasn't because the guy or whoever did it was anatomical precision or knowledge. He just like cut her head off, cut the legs off with a saber. But because of that one mistaken interpretation from the original report that it was somebody that knew about anatomy.
Right.
Oh, and that he looked at a skeleton. I don't know how, or a picture of a skeleton. I'm sorry. He looked at a picture of a skeleton to say, oh, I got a cut here and I got a cut here.
Yeah.
But they said that because of the damage to the vertebrae and everything, he says, no, this was not somebody like a surgeon or somebody, but it threw police totally off of who the perpetrator was. But getting back to that Jack the Ripper is like the question mark. But, and getting back to the story of Dracula, one of the things I've discovered is that in that area, like the Czech Republic, Poland, Transylvania, they do believe in, they have those deviant burials where they've opened graves and they really believe that vampire stuff. That's even nowadays, this is a very serious concern for the people in that area, that as far as that the undead, how's that? That the undead come back.
No, you're absolutely right. And the way Bram Stoker found out about it back in his day, I mean, you and I know about it nowadays, but Bram Stoker, lucky enough, read a book called Land Beyond the Forest, and in it was an essay called Transylvanian Superstitions by a Scottish lady, Emily Gerard, who, like you, Marlene, was really into ghost hunting and that sort of stuff. She moved to Vienna and ended up marrying a guy in a Polish guy in the Austrian-Hungarian cavalry stationed in Transylvania. And when she was in there and he was doing his military stuff, a very bold lady, she was wandering around asking people in small villages, asking priests, asking sort of medicine men, what's all this about? And she wrote up a very detailed report all about Strigoi, Nosferatu, how to kill a vampire, how they are, how they become, a second child of a this, or you're born on a certain calendar day, or somebody out of wedlock, all these weird things. And then if the mourning rituals are not adhered to, or suicide victim, all these things are kind of keeping everybody in order. If they're not adhered to, vampire. So
I even heard at one point that even women that died in childbirth, I was like, wow. But yes, they could produce and they say that they found, besides being buried on their face, sometimes they found like sickles, those old
Skypes. So if they get up, they cut their head off. And so it's as you mentioned, I actually did one of those films I worked with was a series for PBS called Secrets of the Dead, Vampire Legend. And that was all looking into deviant burials and what they tell us. And one of the things, just as you mentioned, I thought maybe you'd seen the show because you knew about this. 2004 in Mariana de Sus, which is a town, an isolated town in Transylvania, there was a modern day virtual, not virtual.
Yes, I think
vampire slaying, where it was Petratoma was the dead guy, and his daughter was dying after he's in the grave, and they figured through superstition that his body, his soul was coming out. And so
there was something that you had a bunch of your family die after you're a certain person died.
That's right. So the wife gave permission to the local, the men in the town. They exhumed the body, cut open the chest, took out the heart, just like 5 days after he died, and brought it to the crossroads, burned it, took the ashes, made like a potion out of it, and fed it to the very sick daughter, and she recovered. So it's maybe it worked. I mean, is it science or is it luck? Coincidence?
Or power of suggestion.
Power of suggestion. Who knows? But the guy that headed up the team of excavators took off because there was such an uproar, almost an embarrassment within the church and the community, that he was kind of in hiding up in the mountains. And these people at Ion Films in England, they found him and interviewed him. And it was very legit. He said, look, this is very matter of fact. This is what we do.
I want to say that probably I did see that, and that it was like a village, and the people there were like, this is the norm for them. Like they can't understand. Like we're gonna handle this.
Yeah, they're not freaking out, like thinking this is really
or like being called like, oh, everybody. You could see all the men They were
Yeah.
like in on this, like, we're going to handle this because
You got it.
and it was like, okay. But again, like you said, this is a 21st century when this is happening, but that belief again, these burial, these old cemeteries that they've dug up either on purpose or by mistake, this goes back also hundreds of years back.
Yeah.
Where they find, and even children, and it could be a man or woman or even a child, that they would bury a certain way if they thought that the person would come back.
Yeah, I've got a friend. I've got quite a few friends. I've been in Romania now 14 times, and I've got a couple of guys over there that have gone with me in searching for Bram Stoker's fictional castle. We've been working on a documentary film, and I asked the question. I said, "Where did this stuff come from?" And one of them, you just triggered this memory, Marlene. If a child dies before it's baptized, that's another.
Of course, yes, absolutely.
Or has some sort of hair lip or some sort of minor disfigurement. They think that's the sign of the devil is on them. And so, just to kind of wrap this piece up with my Uncle Bram, is that he found all this research in the London Library and Whitby Library. He found treatises on all these sort of deviant burials or contagious diseases that made people believe that this was so, that vampirism was potentially real. And as I said earlier, he just packaged this in a way that it's now sort of all these different characteristics attached to Count Dracula that made it so real. So people were already thinking that it's a high possibility because of the stuff done. And he mentioned, Bram did, in one of the only one interview that I've ever found, it's in the British Weekly newspaper by Jane Stoddard. He mentioned 12 countries, and they were the ones that you had mentioned, and plus many more, that he found the vampire myth was very strong.
Yes.
So it's not just one or two. We're talking 12 that he found in 1890. There could have been much more. He just didn't have access to them all.
Yes. Let me ask you, did he believe in the occult, or was this just him thinking?
That's a really good question. And there's nothing that he actually came out saying, "Oh, I believe in this," because no diary. I did find a journal. Right. But I'm going to give you my opinion looking at pieces of a puzzle that I put together. I'm going to tell you the pieces, first of all. First of all, he was mentored by a Professor Edward Dowden at Trinity College, very well-respected conservative professor who was an expert in the occult. I've seen letters that Bram wrote between him and Dowden, him and other people like Pamela Coleman Smith, who was an artist who drew the first Smith-Waite tarot cards.
Yes.
She was a member of the Golden Dawn. So there was proof evidence, let's say, that Bram was very interested in the occult. But I also have read a short story he wrote about second sight, which is like premonitions. And that's part of the whole, occult. I've read a newspaper article by a writer that said, he wrote it in 1931, and he waited about 25 years to write this. I don't know why, but Norval Scrimmanger wrote an article, said, I went to a dinner party to meet Henry Irving, who was in Glasgow to do the play. Afterwards, we had drinks, and I found Bram Stoker much more interesting. He regaled a group of us sitting around the fireplace about two situations where he told us that he experienced this second sight.
Okay.
And one of them was, and I'll just tell it to you guys briefly, he wrote the book in Cruden Bay, Scotland, and the Earl of Errol was the guy in charge of the whole area, lived in a big castle, invited Bram Stoker, like he did other dignitaries, to go pheasant shooting. And when you go pheasant shooting, you're given a guide, or what they call a loader, somebody who'd load the guns for you. So Bram is wandering through the fields. They're all the guys are spread out, but right next to you is your loader, and they carry on a conversation. And Bram says to the loader, well, how is the Earl doing? And this loader, who is from the Highlands of Scotland, said, well, the sheet is very high on the Earl. The sheet is very high on the Earl. Now, what that means back in those days was the death sheet that gets pulled over your head. The winding sheet. Yeah, is high. That doesn't mean he's dead, but it's getting close. And Bram said, don't He's silly. He looks just fine. He's healthy. His color's fine. So they have a nice shoot, and Bram stays there for another 2 weeks, does his writing. The Earl is fine. He comes back the next year, next summer holiday. He's invited again by the Earl, and he goes, "I'd like the same loader." And she gets the same loader, and he says to him, "Now you were wrong, weren't you? The Earl is just fine. It's been a whole year." "Oh no, sir. The sheet is now very high. I see it." 3 days later, the Earl dies unexpectedly of a brain aneurysm.
Wow.
Didn't have a disease like cancer or something.
Right. That you knew he was gonna die.
It was so that is, Marlene, what I can tell you. If Bram recounted that in a serious situation at a dinner party after dinner drinks, and it's written in a newspaper, not nowadays tabloids that just print any kind of crap.
Right.
I believe that's as close as evidence that I have that Bram Stoker was a very open-minded person and believed in things. And he wrote this great quote in the novel that I think is a good way to end this thought is, "There are mysteries in life which men may only guess at, which age by age they may solve only in part."
Well, the thing is that, see, that occurred to him without him really looking for it. This was, which I think those are the best stories. When things happen that you're not out there looking on purpose, to have that moment that he was just going, he was a guest and he's hunting, he's pheasant hunting. The last thing he expects is that he's going to have, somebody handling everything that has second sight, it sounds like. But considering that he was Irish, the belief in the banshee, do you think that played a part in it?
I think all of that did. There was a book that I found in his personal library that one of his great grandsons owned, my cousins, and I was allowed to look through all those books. It was written by Oscar Wilde's mother, Lady Jane Wilde.
Okay.
And it was I've got copies of them right here. It was stories of myth and belief in ancient Ireland, and it went into great detail about the banshees and the fairies and goblins and all these vampire-like creatures, blood-sucking, life-taking creatures. And she actually said in the introduction that the folklore and superstition of Transylvania is very similar to that of Ireland, and that Emily Gerard has written a book on it. For further information, go see this. I think not only was Bram raised on that stuff, that he absorbed all those stories by his mother and his nanny, but he also was redirected later on in life when he's really sitting down looking at all these books and doing his research. He wrote down all 26 books in the back of his notes that he used to research Dracula. So it's not like he was just kind of sitting down willy-nilly looking through books. He was like a student would be doing a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation. He was taking this very seriously and referencing all these serious books.
Well, just out of curiosity, I imagine his material is handwritten, right?
His notes are handwritten, yeah.
Is he easy to understand? Was his writing easy to understand?
Terrible.
No.
Terrible.
I just had to ask.
Oh my gosh. Marlene, it took me and Dr. Elizabeth Miller a year and a half to decipher his journal that we found. My God, it was terrible. But once you get used to it, and we had to use, each of us had our own magnifying glasses, and you could scan it and make it really large on the computer screen.
Right. Okay.
And the reason is, in his job as a theater manager, he wrote, 200 to 400 letters a day.
Yes.
And people joke why doctors have bad because they're whipping off prescriptions. Well, he's writing off full letters to people every day. Lots. I mean, I'm not exaggerating, because he's having to, go to actors and purveyors of equipment, for patrons to get them to buy tickets, all this stuff.
Let me ask you about, this is a short story, Dracula's Guest. All right. That when you read it, how can I say it? And I think this is what was most interesting about the character of Dracula, that obviously he kills you, he's evil, but at the same time he presents a certain way. How can I tell you? Like charming. enigmatic.
Yeah.
But what's the word I'm looking for?
Deception.
Deception. Basically, at the end of the day, you're just food as far as he's concerned. But you still see that he does have some type of
redeeming qualities.
Yeah, kind of. And I know later on they made him, after Bela Lugosi, they've made him more, nice looking and stuff like that. But I think that's one of the most, how can I say it? That he was so three-dimensional. Because you know how sometimes the villain is totally bad, looks ugly, and he's just bad.
But you're right. Bram created a very complex character. And of course, later on, as you say, becomes more humanized. He's got more sexuality. He's got more of a moral compass. But Bram's Dracula, to start with, was like luring in what he needed, the bait. He needed Harker to come into his castle in Transylvania. Number one, finish the transactions for his properties, and then he needed, a blood source. But what he really needed was he was information that he needed to figure out about lawyers, about shipping things, about how to get stuff over to Whitby on train to London. Do you need other lawyers for this? He needed really a source of intelligence. And
I always gathered that he wanted to be, like when he said to London, like a place full of life. But at the same time, he needed, the vampire witches, where he needed to have a place to put his boxes of soil so that he could rest. In other words, he had figured this. Is there ever any explanation why he decides to do that at that point in time after living all these hundreds of years?
I think the explanation that I've seen that makes sense is that he's kind of, there's only those 3 brides in his castle. Yes. You do see the tribe of gypsies that are loyal to him that help him pack up all the boxes of dirt. But there's not a lot of other people around. So maybe he's already gone through the blood sources that he needs, and now he needs to expand hunting grounds. Or, as others have kind of alluded to, well, maybe he's going to London because it is the center of the universe at this time. The Brits, people believe that to be true. Not all countries believe that, but they believe that. Right.
But in comparison to the Carpathian Mountains,
you're really isolated. Now he's curious about what a modern pulsating city would be like, with plenty of victims that he could just easily do away with as a result of the way the Ripper got around everything. Nobody, you could just, people all over the place, so you could just take off with them. So there's really been no explanation. Is he got political motives, what they are, other than just more breeding grounds, which I think that might be the case.
Right. That's the way I looked at it. That I think that what you said, that he was looking for new blood, maybe whether the people there already knew how to, ward off vampires pretty well. Plus, there were very few, I imagine, in comparison to going to a large city.
Right.
But he needed the logistics, in other words, done. Otherwise, he didn't have a castle over there, in other words.
No, but he did have, as you said earlier, he had Carfax Abbey, where some of his, they were actually not coffins, they were crates back in the day. So a couple here, a couple here. So he had them spread out. So as he started to convert his victims, he could then place them into these crates of dirt. But let me just touch on one thing you said earlier, because I want to tell your listeners about Dracula's Guest. It is one of those things that it's a short story. And here's a freebie that I'm giving you guys right now. Okay, this is free. Go to bramstoker.org. It's a free website run by a professor, and he's done a great job. He's placed all of Bram Stoker's novels and short stories that are public domain, and that's most of them.
Okay.
And you can download them on PDF or text for free. And I challenge you tonight. There's a 17-page short story called Dracula's Guest that many scholars were wondering, was this ever part of the novel Dracula?
I read the story. That's why I'm asking.
Bram Stoker's widow, Florence, published it in 1914, 2 years after Bram died. And she said in the preface, this was excised from my husband's most famous work due to length. And some scholars think, oh, that was just a way to sell the story. Well, I will tell you here and now on this show, the Miami Ghost Chronicles, that the research that I've done, I have found the original typescript of Dracula that is owned by the Paul Allen Estate in Seattle, Washington. And I've been able to look through that whole typescript. And I've seen the 101 pages, or not, I haven't seen those pages. I've figured out why 101 pages were taken out, and the typescript starts on page 102. And Dracula's guest was part of those 101 pages taken out. And the reason I can say that beyond a shadow of doubt, imagine this now, the other 480 pages of the typescript was all typed, and certain things were crossed out by hand. So if the first 101 pages were taken out by either Bram or his publisher, Bram or his publisher had to go through the rest of the typescript and cross out anything that happened in those 101 pages.
Right, that reference that, yes.
That reference it. It wouldn't have made sense. So I found 4 very specific references to things that could only
that would
happen
have been
in Dracula's guest, crossed out of the rest of the manuscript. And here's the little hint for you without a spoiler. It is Jonathan Harker.
Okay, it is Jonathan Harker.
It doesn't mention his name, but it is
right. That's why I'm asking. Yes.
Okay, it's him, and he stops in Munich because that is the way Bram described the train route, both in real from the books he looked at and in his own notes. So he stops in Munich for a day and a night, and he takes a carriage ride out to the countryside, and very weird stuff happens.
Yes.
So basically, the reason that's important for me is when J.D. Barker and I wrote the prequel to Dracula, called Dracul, we wanted our story to end exactly where Bram Stoker had originally planned Dracula to begin, which is in this small village on the outskirts of Munich, the village of the damned. Our story ends there. That's where Dracula guessed most of it takes place. And then it proceeds with Harker going back into Munich. He goes to the opera, goes to the night of the opera. The next day he goes to the Munich Dead House, and weird stuff happens there. And then he gets on the train and heads off to Transylvania.
Right, it's a good story. This portion is like a foreshadowing, because see, he's thinking all he's doing is just a legal trip to get signature. So this is like a foreshadowing of what's to come.
Yes.
Because I always thought that when I read, I was like, wait a minute.
Yes.
And I was thinking, is this Jonathan Harker? But it doesn't say.
Well, you were right. You were absolutely right. And he also mentioned in the typescript, the dead man come alive in the Munich Dead House. That's crossed out. He says Count Dracula, he looks like the dead man who came alive in the Munich Dead House, crossed out. And that's not in Dracula's guest. That was in the event after Dracula's guest ends, but before he gets on the train to go off to Transylvania. So there's more evidence. And like I've got it, and I've actually published it in a copy of Dracula annotated for the 125th anniversary with everything taken out, put back in, and you can get it on Amazon. Dracula annotated for the 125th anniversary.
Because that was all the extra stuff that you found through your research, right?
Yes, and now I'm sharing it with people.
Yes, that's great. That's fantastic, because there's, how can I say, everybody wants to go beyond the how can I say, the Dracula universe, as far as, what was, and I know that, did he truly use Vlad the Impaler as the inspiration for Dracula?
He was one of them, Marlene. He was one of them. Let's go back to the occult for a moment and hold the fascination with evil and the devil. So Henry Irving plays Mephistopheles on stage, the devil. Bram is in Whitby Library and he picks up a book by William Wilkinson. It says Dracula in the Valachian language means devil.
Yes.
And then he's in the London Library. He sees a book by James Samuelson and he says Vlad Dracula III was such a horrific warrior, did all these atrocious things. He was known as the devil. So it comes back to Bram's desire to capitalize on the mysteries of the occult. His Dracula is the devil incarnate turned into a count, a human being. And Vlad Dracula's backstory, all the stuff in the chapter 2 where Dracula says, yes, I did this, these battles, I did this, that's all the backstories of Vlad the Impaler. Now,
Yes.
Bram did have to move the Wallachian prince to a count in Transylvania, but that's only like one state away, so it wasn't too big of a shift. But he needed a believable human being with a real backstory to make this devil incarnate have life, let's say.
Right, exactly. And that's, well, the backstory is like everything. When people weave fiction with historical fact, it makes it more believable.
It does. It does. The movies have done more, like the 92
Yes.
Coppola film did much more to link Vlad the Impaler with his conversion to become a vampire. And so did Ken Russell film with Jack Palance. So others have done it. The whole Dracula Untold with Luke Evans is like absolutely Vlad the Impaler turning into a vampire to protect his people. But Bram Stoker did it very subtly, just by using the name and some of the backstory.
And I know in the bio it mentioned that you've done, and you said tours over in Transylvania. Yeah. From what I understand, Vlad is seen in different light from the people that live in that area.
Oh, he's like the hero. I mean, they kind of giggle at us because, hey, we come over, we're looking for the vampires, guys, and where's Vlad the Impaler, the vampire? And it's like, most of them are polite. He's not a vampire. That was Hollywood, and that was Mr. Stoker. He was. If you know your history and you look at it, for 7.5 years, 3 different reigns, Vlad Dracula had to unify a country, Wallachia, Transylvania, and Moldavia, and come together to hold off the mighty Ottoman Empire.
Yes,
it was like a group of 40,000 warriors, guerrilla warriors, really, against an army with heavily armed with guns and cannons, 400,000 coming over from the Ottoman world to take over Christian Europe. And the reason Vlad Dracula was so successful, not only because of the Carpathian Mountains and the narrow mountain passes and the way they could defeat armies using guerrilla warfare tactics, was that he also practiced this horrific things of impalement, which scared the heck out of.
I was gonna say, he did like a big psyop on them. Like, okay,
a psyop for sure. And it's like, who is this devil? Who is this man that could do this? It's just unheard of. And they were scared to death of him. Sure. And he was successful, but only for 7.5 years.
Well, when you look at it, and see, that's the thing also. I'm not saying, but we also look at it through our modern sensibilities, which is, wow, that's a horrible thing to do. But again, back then,
it's natural. We judge, right? We oh my God, he did this. But when you take it in perspective, and I've chatted with many people over there, it's like, well, Dacre, you've got to understand, even his own country wasn't unified. And some of them were paying tributes to the Sultan to stop bothering them. They would give away gold, give away children, give away food. And it was like, hell no, we're going to fight these guys, but we must all need to be together on this. And if you're not together, you're against us. And then he would impale this guy. Or he would take all these ruling class, the boyars, and march them off and make them do forced labor. It sounds terrible, but it was what they could do with what they had in very, turbulent times and very vicious times.
And by the way, the Ottoman Turks were not nice. It wasn't like they were playing and everybody there, the warfare was very savage.
Yes.
On both sides.
I'm glad you said that. You're absolutely right. But it's a lovely country. And I got to tell you something that just in the last couple of days, Marlene, it's come around. The group I work with, Experienced Transylvania Tour Company, is a wonderful company run by Gloria Anderson, her sister Nora. We've been doing these for a couple of years. Last year, we went with Vincent Price's daughter.
Oh, you're kidding.
And
wow.
Some of her fan base and some of mine, we had like 23 of us. And we traveled around and saw all the cool places. This year, it's just about to hit the internet waves. We've actually rented Bran Castle on the 28th of October for our own private party of the people on the tour, and friends of mine run the Dracula Film Festival in nearby Brasov, and I'm being asked to do a lecture there, an audiovisual lecture. So we're going to be inviting them to come to our party. So if any of you listeners are dying to go to Transylvania, what better time to go than during Halloween, and come with me and our group and check out experience-transylvania.com, and you'll see the details.
Wow, that's got to be the ultimate Halloween, I'll tell you that much.
It's going to be so cool. Yeah.
What are they what site would they go to? Would they go to your site?
No, the best one to go to, even though you could go to my Facebook page, Dacre Stoker Author, and I'm publicizing it, but the actual site for the tour company, experience-transylvania.com, and they've got all the details there. And let me just say this. People say, oh, this Bran Castle, what's Dracula's castle? You know, that's a lot of hooey. I say, no. Again, in those books, Marlene, in the London Library, I have found that there were 2 sketches of castles in all the books Bram used for his research.
Okay.
And they were this castle, the same sketch by different artists of Bran Castle. The only castle in any of those books. And the way Bram described the exterior of his fictional castle Dracula is exactly the same as you would or I would do it when you look at these 2 sketches. So I've told that to the manager of the place. They use that in their marketing now, that they can legitimately say this is partially Dracula's castle. It's also Queen Marie and so on. But you know, there is a direct link to Dracula in the castle. Vlad the Impaler may have visited it, but he didn't live there and rule from there. But we are going to go see his birthplace in Sigishwara. We're going to see places where he had battles and so on. So we're going to see the Count Dracula places and Vlad Dracula places, drink some good wine, and have a hell of a good party at Bran Castle.
Probably a lot of good stories. Let me ask you, is it still true, and I don't know if I'm remembering correctly, that they've never been able to find where Vlad the Impaler was buried?
Correct. One of the coolest mysteries going. Either Snagoff Monastery, there's, you know, they've exhumed a grave, they found wolf bones and some coins from the era when Vlad was living. But there's also another Komana Monastery. I've been there. It was kind of hard to talk my way in because I had my friends and interpreters, but the monks there were kind of worried that, you know, am I trying to exploit this and make a big deal about it? They don't really want, and I get it, foreigners, especially someone like me who writes books about it and so on, to publicize something that they want to be kept very secretive.
Right, especially about Dracula and something.
Yeah, they don't want any desecration, whereas some of them will sell their soul to sell a figure of Count Dracula. Others, you know, want to make sure his gravesite is a place where he can rest in peace. So that's still one of the mysteries. They've never found his headless body. They know he was, or they think he was decapitated by the Turks with the head brought back to Constantinople to prove he was dead. They've never found the head. They've never found the rest of the body.
And Dennis, wouldn't it be funny if you think, somebody does know, but it's landed in a place, whether it's a monastery or a church, where they exactly feel that way. And they say, you know, we will never talk about this because the last thing we want is to become a tourist spot. And maybe there's somebody that does have definitive proof that they have Vlad the Impaler's remains.
That would be such a cool story, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Can you imagine? Yeah, we're going to keep it. And again, it has been wonderful to speak to you. And I know, and I asked you, you're working on another book right now, right? Because you have several books.
Things in the works. So here we go. Dr. Leverett Butts, a professor at University of North Georgia, and I are working on The Ally of Madness, which is the actual story of the summer in Cruden Bay, Scotland, where Bram actually wrote Dracula. And that is finished, or at least it's finished at this stage. It's out being looked at by publishers. So that's one book. I've got a film, a documentary film with a buddy, Jason Figgis and John West, that is actually all the footage has been shot, narration done. We're just about to go into an Indiegogo campaign on April 1st to raise money for the editing of it, because it's being done with no studios. We're just doing it seat of our pants, but it's all an in-depth look at a lot of things I talked about tonight. I've got a couple of comic books with something called the Stokerverse. You can go check out thestokerverse.com. Me and Chris McCauley have got second edition of a comic book coming out called Dracula the Return, Cult of the White Worm. We've got an RPG game out. We've got a video game coming out. So yeah, we got a lot of stuff going on. I'm just trying to go beyond just normal literature to help people connect with Bram Stoker's legacy in a number of different ways.
I don't think he could ever have realized the far-reaching effects of the story.
Yeah, that's why he needed a number of people in his family, not just his lifetime, to pass it on and on. So this is just my duty for these years that I'm doing it. And I'm just hoping that my son, who's doing his PhD English literature, who has actually come with me to Transylvania on some tours, that he'll pick up the mantle when I've had enough.
Absolutely. Wow, that's great. Because you're thinking, sometimes, believe it or not, kids don't do what you like. You know, they have their own ideas. So that's great that you have a son that's keep on going with all this, you know, research that you've done and everything that you've discovered. Because I think everybody's always curious, you know, what goes on in an author's head, you know, for them to come out with what they did. You know, it's something that's really the filter of everything.
I mean, it really is. I mean, and I don't have any prophetic answers, but it's reading stuff, listening to books on tape, getting into good places like a long walk in the woods or walking my dog and just clearing your head and coming up with ideas. And then sometimes sitting down with, you know, getting on the phone. My son and his wife live out in Dallas, so I'll talk to him about it and kick around ideas, or my wife or someone else. That's why I love working with co-authors, is that I'm always never that sure if my ideas are any good. And so it's like, let's bounce off ideas and create an outline. And so, it's really interesting to turn the page, or let's say this, it's like turning back the curtain like the Wizard of Oz and seeing what went on in Bram's mind and his research and his writing. And I hope that the stuff that I've shared with you guys will get some people here to take a look at Dracula or Bram Stoker in a different light.
Let me ask you the one last question. Do you think there's any of his works that have not been found or unpublished or anything like that?
Oh, funny you should say that. There is a guy in Dublin, Ireland, a major league collector, big time collector. I won't say his name for privacy purposes, but he ended up, as he was getting older and his wife passed away unexpectedly, he decided, and I talked to him a lot about this. He over 40 years collected a lot of things, and one of them was an unfinished manuscript of a story that he purchased at an auction, and it was no question it was Bram. He sold everything to Emory University in Atlanta, which is great because he realized everything that he'd amassed in 40 years needed to go to a place that had public access to it.
Okay.
But he sent me a copy of this unfinished manuscript. And I can't tell you the name of it now, but I'm telling you this, Marlene, it's on my to-do list to continue that story when my deck is clear, when I've got time and I'm in the right space, and when I also choose the right co-author, maybe my son, once I'm in the right place. I'm not in the right place for it now. It's a really big responsibility to continue something. Do
you really think that it's Bram Stoker?
Oh, there's no question it's Bram.
Okay.
No question.
I was going to say, you're the perfect person I know that because you read all his material.
Well, I found links to the ideas in this unfinished manuscript in his journal.
Okay.
So I am convinced it's his. So that's a great way to leave people in a cliffhanger.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yes.
And
the reason why I asked that is when you said about that, as an author, you kick things around. And I think all authors sometimes come up with ideas or a story and they go, oh, God, this is awful, or this is not good.
Yeah.
And they put it aside.
Yep.
And then that's why I asked you that question because of what you said. But
Great
anyway.
Question. Sometimes those same thoughts we have may germinate and you just triggers another thought and it goes from being a not such a good idea to, ooh, I could do something with this.
Yes.
And you share it with a buddy. Usually a glass of wine helps. You get loosened up a bit. And then it's like, oh yeah, we can do something with
the
it.
possibilities.
What about this? Yeah.
Yes.
But it takes trust. You know, it
Oh
takes
yeah. Oh yeah,
trust
of course.
in
Of
those
course.
ideas with your writing partner to be able to share that and not feel like you're sharing some stupid idea that they just laugh at
They're
you
gonna
for.
go, really?
Yeah, exactly.
Again, Dacre, it has been wonderful to speak to you, and I'm gonna put a link to your website here on the credits of the show, and I wish you the best of luck, and I will be following because I'm fascinated with the whole subject. To be honest with you.
Well, thank you. So you got dacrestoker.com is my
Yes.
personal site, and then thestokerverse.com is where you see all my products, and then bramstokerestate.com is where you can buy all the books that I've written.
Oh, perfect. Okay. All right. Excellent. But let me
Okay.
ask you, out of your website, your personal website, does it have links just in case to any of these sites?
Dacrestoker.com, I think it does. No, actually, the stokerverse.com is the best one to go to.
The Stokerverse.
That's got links to the other things. Yes. If we're
Okay.
going to do
All
one,
right.
that's the best way to go.
That's the best one.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm looking at that now.
Okay.
Again, thank you so much. It has
Marlene,
been wonderful.
thank you for your interest and keep the ghost hunters on their toes. I really appreciate
Yes,
what you do.
of course. And this is the one that scares everybody, the vampire.
Okay.
And I'm not talking about Twilight either. You know, that I forget the guy with the that rides around a Volvo. That's not a real vampire as far as I'm concerned. You know, I like the Dracula version. Again, thank you, Dacre. Take care.
All right. Good night.
But good night. Oh, let me tell you, he must have. Can you imagine? You're reading all this material. Not only is it one of your ancestors, but it's the material that I want to say of. God, all the stories that came out of that time period. I mean, so many versions, so many reimaginings, but of that original framework has come forward. And let's face it, it's, like I said, it's gone from the Bela Lugosi or that Nosferatu, which was at the turn of, early 20th century, to Twilight. I don't know. In other words, that they, how can I say? I can understand the idea of making him mysterious and enigmatic, but at the end of the day, this is a creature of the night who feeds on human blood. Okay, in other words, this thing of making him all like I want to become a vampire is like, stop and think about what it is, because even at the conclusion of the Francis Ford Coppola's film, even when he's there, what he asks for is, I want peace. In other words, whatever, if he's possessed, demonized, because that's part of being a vampire, at the end of the day, really what he wants more than anything is peace. So, in other words, the existence, everybody, whether it's Anne Rice's novels, about all the Lestat and all these different vampires, the immortality portion. If you read, well, I've read a lot of her books. The immortality thing kind of gets old. I don't know, pun intended, but it outwears its how can I say, its allure. And either the vampires become superficial, and let's get back to this thing of Dracula. He is a monster, and he's a vampire, and I think when they humanize him too much, it kind of loses part of its appeal. And I'm going to give you, for instance, for example, in Salem's Lot, Stephen King's story that they made into a movie. They made that vampire. That was a scary those vampires were scary. Okay, the vampire up on the hill, he was scary. The people that became vampires were scary. There was nothing attractive or, oh, I want to be one of those, which is really what I think is the good vampire. All right, and I've always heard people talk about, vampires and werewolves. And one of the things is, if you were a werewolf, you could pass yourself off as human, all right? For most of the time. You could go about in daylight, and you could pretend to be normal. And then, maybe you had 2 or 3 nights there where you had to get locked up or go out into the countryside, whatever you were going to do. But the rest of the time you could pass yourself off as a normie. Whereas the vampire, that's it. You were limited to nighttime, and the blood was always, that's really what your master was the need for blood. And of course, and you think about it, the vampires, I'm talking of prototypical vampires. I'm not talking about the nice vampires who, drive around a Volvo. Was it part of becoming a vampire that made you cruel? Or was it just that you had to become cruel, even if you were not a cruel person to begin with, but because that was the only way you could continue to exist? Or did it just become an attribute of being a vampire? All right, that was one of the things that came with it, besides the thirst for blood kind of deal. And it almost always makes you think, in the case of, let's say, Dracula, where here he goes off to London, he's purchased Carfax Abbey, he's taken pains to get these boxes of earth distributed, and he is, and it makes you think, this is just and I wish I'd asked Dacre about this, but anyway, what would have happened if he wouldn't have been stopped, if he would have stayed in London for some reason? That he, somewhere along the line, he realizes, you know what, if I kill Van Helsing, this effort will fall apart and they'll never find me. And he's able to do away with Van Helsing. One of those deals that makes you think, what would have happened? All right. Would Lucy have continued to prey on people? Did he do this as a distraction away from him? All right. That kind of deal. It's very, what would have happened if Dracula wouldn't have been stopped in London and had to run back to Transylvania before they came for him? Which, who was it? Was it in Francis Ford Coppola's version? I can't remember. Where basically the fact that he leaves, basically that he flees, shows that he's afraid. Because always the thought is, he has a mastery over all these different things of the night and whatever. And in other words, nothing is, even though he had all these powers, at the end he says, I need to get out of Dodge and let me go back to the Carpathian, where over there I really am the master. And I've got my gypsies to back me up. Because again, despite everything, he is limited to only being to go about at night. In the daytime, he is vulnerable. And I think that's really at the heart of it, was something that even with all his powers as a vampire, he could not get around. Which is, no matter what, you have to go to Earth during the daytime at sunrise. So, and I think he realized, man, if I don't get out of here, I'm toast. But it's very interesting. Very interesting. And again, I'm going to put a link to to his website, and I'll put, as a matter of fact, I'm looking at this one, Stokerverse. Looks great. Okay. Which is like about what readers are saying about the Stokerverse, because I guess this is really what everybody's hungry for, is like, what happens beyond the story of Dracula, either before or after, or parallel stories kind of deal. Well, anyway, guys, I hope you liked this interview. I really enjoyed it. I think it's fascinating. I have a lot of other interesting guests that are going to come on for already into season 16 of Stories of the Supernatural. You can find links to everything on MiamiGhostChronicles.com, mppellicer.com. Please sign up for my newsletter on Substack. You can find a link at mppellicer.com. And on there, I send out links to old videos, podcasts, books, stories, articles, maybe once, twice a week, something like that. So that's a good way. But if you find the show, whether it's Stories of the Supernatural or Nightshade Diary or Supernatural Storytime, on any, whether it's the video version or the podcast version, subscribe so that you get announced. I try to always premiere the shows so that you get a heads up when they're going to be released. So again, I want to thank you for being part of my audience. You are all wonderful. And again, don't forget, I would give anything to go to that tour. What a tour for Halloween. I tell you something, that's got to be the ultimate Halloween tour. Wow. All right. Till next time, you guys. Take care.